You're not going to get out of here, as George C. Scott famously said in Doctor Strangelove. We're not going to get out of here without getting our hair mussed. He's talking about nuclear war, of course, but this is financial nuclear war. It's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. But we can have painful and difficult, or we can have Armageddon. Your choice. I'm hedged with gold. I don't know that, like everybody else, I'm not telling you I know what's the outcome's going to be. So don't be dumb, but bet on both sides.
All right, today we're going to chat with Tom Luongo, who's of course a geopolitical and financial analyst and the host of the Gold, Codes and Guns podcast. Tom, thanks for making the time today. Appreciate that. It feels like there's a lot of chaos in the world today, the world that we're in. We'll be talking about plenty of those topics in just a second. But are we in a time of great change right now?
I think the best way to look at this is that this is a period of flux, and there's an inflection point across a number of different verticals. And the question is, trying to figure out which one of them is, what inflection point are we actually dealing with? I mean, we can see it financially, we can see it geopolitically, we can see it even from the Americans' perspective, a domestic policy shift. We can see cultural shifts happening. We can see, geomagnetic inflection points. Everything is occurring all at the same time. But the question then is, from our perspective as commentators and analysts, like what's the root cause of all of the conflict that we're seeing around that inflection point? And I keep coming back to the same thing over and over again, which is, because I would like to see something different, but I just don't. And that is that it's the old colonial powers of Europe realize that they have to make their stand here after having dominated pretty much the financial and industrial world for anywhere from, depending on the way you want to look at it, 300 to 500 years. And now we're watching them in their, I wouldn't say death throes, right? Because it's too early for that. But they're in that cornered animal moment. They're in that cornered snake moment. And they're beset on all sides by other civilizations that have refused to knuckle under. And now they're having to fight in a way that they haven't fought in the past with inferior tools. In the past, they always had superior tools, and they were able to get away with it. World War I, World War II, Napoleon, yada, yada, yada. But this time is different because now you have an America that is looking for their own independence. Now you have a China that's powerful enough to stand up. Now you have a Russia that is as powerful, is maybe more powerful now, especially in the nuclear age, than it was under the Tsar, right? So we have that, and I think all three of those people have decided that they no longer want to be ruled by Europe, and that there's nothing really that Europe can schmooze them on and sell them on, and sell the division and try and stoke division between them on to make it all work, to make it work for their advantage. And that's what they've always done in the past, the kind of classic divide and rule plays. And then you have the secondary powers that have all signed on to this as well. You have the Gulf Arab states. You have Iran. You have to a lesser extent even Brazil. And certainly Japan, and none of them are down with the old, what I like to call down with the Comintern, right? And that, so when you view it from that lens, right, then so many of the little bits of chaos and the things that don't seem to be congruous become very clear. And I know that that's, and I know that there's a lot of pushback to my perspective on this from people who can't see it from that multifaceted perspective, and they're, linear thinkers cannot deal with this at all. This is a nonlinear arrangement, and that's, it's part of what I've been screaming about now for months, if not a little over a year, which is that we have people who were right about a lot of the way the world operates, when the world was operating under a different rubric. And it was easy to be a critic of the United States when the United States was fully captured by globalist factions within Europe. It was easy. Well, yeah, we're the agent of chaos. We're the Rambo without a jockstrap, going around the world and starting wars and overthrowing governments and and all that stuff. And that's not the United States anymore. And a lot of people are having a very hard time reconciling those changes and embracing them as represented by Donald Trump and the people that he has around him. And I say that knowing that Trump is full of faults. I say that knowing that Trump has a lot of deficits. All right, I know that he has a very complicated political situation domestically, but with a modicum of generosity, just a small bit of generosity to him and the coalition that obviously backs him domestically, that doesn't openly talk about their support for him, which is there. It's kind of a mirror. Trump is the focal point, but Trump is a reflection. But you see Trump, but behind Trump's image in the mirror is all of these shadowy figures. And I would put Wall Street there. I would put there's clearly patriotic elements within the DOD and the State Department and even the intelligence services. And, of course, little tech as represented by Elon Musk. And you have that group of people. Clearly, the only reason Trump is still alive and even in power is because they're there backing him. Now, they have their own objectives. They have their own incentives. They have their own agendas. They're not necessarily all pulling in the same way towards the same outcome. There's fights and divisions within them, but all of them realize that if what I call Davos, the old colonial powers of Europe, if they win this fight, if they're able to break that coalition apart, then Davos will win, because you pick off the United States, recapture it. Now you can send the combined power of the United States and the rest of NATO against Russia. Russia falls, Iran falls, eventually China falls. So that's the plan in Brussels and Davos and Zurich and everywhere else in the city of London. And that's very clear, and even to a lesser extent Tel Aviv, because I don't think they're the drivers of this. I just think they're part of the process, part of the coalition. And, everybody else is lining up going, you know what? We're done with you guys. This is it. It's over. And so this is going to break this breaks a lot of people's conceptions of how the world operates. Every time I do one of these, there's always over my right shoulder my copy of the board game Dune, which is one of the great board games of all time in modeling emergent and shifting alliances and betrayals. And every time I talk about these things this way, I'm like, what people don't realize is that, in Dune, there's a moment where, a card gets flipped every round. And if this particular card comes up, the game stops and everybody can make new alliances or break old alliances. Well, that's what's happening right now. We're in that we already had one of those happen, and everybody's still analyzing the game board as if that didn't happen. Okay. And the problem is, of course, is that no one in geopolitics, in the board game, everybody has to announce, yep, we, the Atreides, the Bene Gesserit, and the Harkonnens are now in a coalition together, and we're going to go for the win together. That doesn't happen in geopolitics. China, Russia, and the United States are never going to announce to Europe that they're all working in parallel tasks to break Europe. They're just going to do so. And then, they're always going to talk from their own personal perspective as to what their goals and what their incentives are. But when you look at the overlap of the Venn diagram of their incentives, you're like, well, it's all the same thing. So I'm not in any way, manner, shape, or form saying that like Trump, Putin, and Xi are coordinating any of this. Of course not. But they are riffing off of each other. They are reacting to each other in real time. They're reading what Trump does. Putin reads what Trump does. Trump reads what Putin does. Putin and Xi, they're obviously in some form of an alliance together. Xi and they all read and react off of each other. and then we see the reactions from Europe, right? And then you have other powers like Giorgia Meloni in Italy and Viktor Orban in Hungary and blah blah blah, blah. And they all that are also very good leading indicators of where things are going to go next. And a lot of the figures that we see moving around the world and the pawns that are being moved around, for lack of a better metaphor, the chessboard, they're the messengers, right? So Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and Mike Pompeo going to Ukraine last week, that was a message. That was a message from Davos. Oh, by the way, Donald Trump, you're going to do this, this, and this, or we're going to scuttle your budget reconciliation bill and destroy your presidency. And Trump's like, that's nice. I'll pick a fake fight with Elon Musk and get everybody to now get the Democrats to say, hey, let's release the Epstein list. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is the way the game is played, folks. This is what statecraft looks like. This is what fifth generation warfare looks like. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with this, but it sounds like 4D chess, and it's not. It's just the way people actually operate in real time. This is what power politics actually looks like. And Davos is still fighting a kind of reputational war, and guys like Putin, Xi, and Trump are fighting the war with leverage, and real leverage, economic leverage, political leverage, military leverage, collateral leverage, which is ultimately comes down to commodities and energy, right? Davos is still screaming about climate change and that stuff, and they're trying to fight political fights within domestic, with their assets that they have placed in, from their perspective, foreign governments and foreign institutions in order to undermine the political power of those places that they're at war with. That kind of Lady Macbeth style politics fails in the face of a, not, for lack of a better term, an authoritarian leader who has the backing of the people behind him and the backing of the powerful political and the powerful institutions within the country. And Trump has that, for better or worse. He doesn't have it fully, but he has more of it than we've ever seen in our lifetimes in the United States. And that's why it's so very difficult for people to map this. Or they just don't believe it, and that's fine. If you don't believe it, well, that's fun, but I hate to tell you this, you're going to be roadkill in 6 months. You will be. And I don't want to see good people who couldn't keep up, fail, because we need more. We still need competent commentators and analysts in the space, and because the mainstream media is hopeless, because they're hopelessly captured. So we have an alt media now that's incredibly confused. I did a whole podcast with Joaquin Flores on this very point. Episode 219 of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. And I think it's very important that people understand what I'm getting at here. Because it's, this is the moment in time. It's that, you opened it with that question. Is this an important moment? It is. And it means that sometimes you're just going to have to live with, less than perfect outcomes. So. Okay. So that's my opening. That's my thesis statement for June 6th. 2025. We'll see what it is on June 13th. Mind you, next week it could be different, but right now that's where we are.
Of course. And there's so many threads to pull there, Tom, and I really appreciate your characterizations. Show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes, a classic Charlie Mungerism. I think there's definitely truth in that. You already hinted at the conflict we've seen between Elon Musk and Trump. I would like to zoom in a bit on that. You already started talking about 4D chess versus chaotic movement. Where on the scale do you think really the Trump camp is between a 4D chess master or just a completely chaotic person following their own incentives?
I don't really believe in 4D chess. I never have. I think that 4D chess is it's like conspiracy theory. It's a phrase seeded by our intelligence agencies to rob us of our agency. Oh, you have a counter narrative. That's just a conspiracy theory. I'm reading the game board. That's just Trump playing 4D chess. He doesn't have a plan. He does. He just doesn't operate linearly. And he even told us this during the campaign. He's like, I weave. whenever I do a thing, I talk about this. Trump communicates differently than a lot of people are comfortable with. And, look, and Elon Musk is a different type of play. There was a great post this morning on Twitter, or last night on Twitter, that I saw this morning about the difference between the way Trump and Musk operate and the way they think. And they were using the Myers-Briggs IP on trees scale, INTJs versus ENEST, whatever. It doesn't matter. They're two personality types and thinkers that are completely opposite. And I'm not a huge fan of that interface, of that metaphor, but it has some helpful value here to understand why and how Musk and Trump blew up on this. But I also think that a lot of it is not true either. Like Musk coming out and like saying that Trump's on the Epstein files list is just stupid. Like it's just dumb because, and anybody who falls for that, like they should really check their. I mean, I'm sorry, but I think my therapist is taking new patients, guys. Like seriously, if Trump was there, they would have used it on him and destroyed him reputationally when he was out of power. They would have used it on him for ages ago. Like they would have. It's so it's not it's not the kind of thing it's not the card you, and if it is true, let's just assume that maybe it is true. Okay, let's play the opposite side of that in some way, manner, shape, or form, Donald Trump was, in Epstein's orbit in a way that was more than just taking a page 3 photograph to get on the New York Post when he was, trying to sell whatever his latest building project was, which is the most likely source of any pictures that you have historically of Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein being together. But let's assume the worst. Let's be as ungenerous as possible. Clearly, even if Trump is there are a lot of other people that are in far worse shape vis-a-vis the Epstein list than Trump is. And so if you're going to use that card, that means you're burning how many other people at the same time? And that then begs the question, how desperate are you to burn down Donald Trump at this particular moment in time over this particular bill, over this particular set of political circumstances? It screams of desperation. So then the big question, of course, is why would Elon Musk do that? Well, he wouldn't unless he felt just like completely betrayed and, he was off his meds and, all the rest of it. Which, it's not like Elon Musk is the most stable guy in the world. He's a bit of a spurg. And that's just the way things are. And, did he have a meltdown? Yeah. Did he and Trump get into it because Trump demands loyalty and isn't particularly good at communicating why you need to be loyal to me? Yeah. Is that a deficit of Donald Trump's? Absolutely. He's been doing it for years. It's nothing new. And Elon Musk is the latest example of that. So they've already started like kissing and making up. I'm not really worried about it. There is another angle on this, and I'm going to put it out there, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but it is something that I've heard discussed. Like my community has been discussing this a little bit, which is that all of this happens 4 or 5 days after the big attack by Ukraine on the Russian nuclear triad, right? The nuclear bomber fleet. Clearly, they use not only the local Russian cell towers, but they use Starlink to coordinate and move the drones. Elon is implicated then because he could have or should have cut off Ukraine's access to Starlink, and now he needs some kind of political cover to get out from underneath that. Right? Trump needs the political cover to walk away from the entire affair. So you could make the argument that they staged this fight in order for Elon to protect Starlink in effect by appearing to defect and change sides, and Trump gets the political cover to eventually walk away from all of this by repudiating Elon. At the end of the month, at the end of June, the Biden promised aid to Ukraine runs out, and I do believe that includes Ukraine's contract with Starlink or access to Starlink. So, I throw it out there. I'm not sure I buy it, but it is at least it is an angle on this that we have to posit and consider.
It's an interesting angle, and I believe to really understand the depth of this argument, you need to understand why the bombing of the strategic bombers in Russia with this drone attack is so important. Why is that so? Perhaps you can explain that.
Well, I mean, think of it this way: the Ukraine escalating to that level with the help of British intelligence, while aspects of our intelligence services hid this operation from Donald Trump. And by extension, one has to argue Tulsi Gabbard at DNI, right? Now, you'll notice that Gabbard has not said anything, and Trump is taking all the heat while people like Hegseth and Gabbard and do their jobs behind the scenes, and to a lesser extent, Marco Rubio do their work behind the scenes. Again, I'm going to do a little bit of a weave here, but here's the headline from this morning, which is that Hegseth just replaced a whole lot of military commanders in Europe around Eurocon and CENTCOM. Eurocom and CENTCOM. Now, are we moving out old traitorous people within that organization? This is 3 weeks out from the NATO summit. This is just before the G7. Like, all of these things are happening in the next couple of weeks. You've got a lot happening here. And we're pushing towards all of this towards the end of the month. So, again, I wasn't being facetious when I said this is my thesis statement on June 6th. My thesis statement may change about where we are by the 20th or the 27th, because a lot of things are going to occur in the next month. And, so that was personally, I mean, it's obvious that was a move that contemporaneous with the Istanbul talks, forcing them to be a nothing burger. Ukraine goes in with the same EU-style negotiating tactics. Hey, we'll give you back the money we stole from you, but you got to give everything back in return. Nonsense. These are the same, ridiculous negotiating points that Zelensky's had for 3 years, while he loses hundreds of square kilometers of territory a day. Okay, fine. And then on the other side, the Russians say, well, these are our red lines. We don't have to change anything. So Putin now has the right to say you attack civilians by attacking the civilian, not just the strategic bombers. Those are a legitimate military target. Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, lies through his teeth when he's in the freaking Oval Office yesterday to Trump and says, we've only attacked strategic military targets. I'm like, really? So you attacked a passenger train? Okay, you can make the argument that we had to blow up a bridge, but did you have to blow up the bridge while the train was there? Really? Okay. Did you really have to bomb the Moscow Opera House because there was strategic value there and kill 150 some odd people? Really? Okay. Yeah, all right, fine. Lie through your teeth again, you Nazi. Like, seriously. And he did that in front of Trump. So Trump then, of course, reminded him about how he's dependent now on American oil and gas to run his economy, and the German economy is contracting at a rate that Zero Hedge put it out yesterday. That's the bank closures and business failures are happening at a rate that's faster than 2008. So, oh, by the way, while all of this chaos is supposedly happening here in the U.S., Europe, the center of the European economy is literally falling off a cliff. Now, all of that is intended to try and force Trump into backing an extension of aid to Ukraine. That's why Graham and Blumenthal went. That's why Lindsey Graham flexed and said, I have enough votes in the Senate for a new ruinous sanctions package on Russia and all of its trading partners, blah, 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 blah. Well, let's call your bluff, Lindsey, and let's find out what that actually looks like when you go to the Senate with that. Clearly, what Graham was saying is, extend Ukraine aid, and I'll vote for the bill. That's simple. Guess what? It's not going to happen. So I look at Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal and, to a lesser extent, Mike Pompeo, all of whom are guilty of the Logan Act, all of whom are messengers on behalf of the treasonous portion of the American government to, bring messages to NATO in order to, this is the way this works now. No one trusts digital communications, so we're back to human resources. This is the way Trump operates, by the way. Trump only works through people for trusted messages. Witkoff, for example. Viktor Orban last summer when he made that world tour and he went and visited everybody. He went and visited Putin, then he went and visited Xi, then he visited Maloney, then he visited this one, then he went to Lula, and then he wound up in Mar-a-Lago. Like, what do you think he was doing? Right? So, that attack gave Putin every justification to upgrade the war if he so chooses. Then he bombs Kiev. Then he bombs the crap out of Kiev. Did he attack only legitimate military targets? Probably not. But again, you want to blow up a bridge because a rail line because you know that the Russians' military's logistics run on trains and not on cars and planes, which it does. Well, that's fine. That's legitimate, right? I get that. I'm not going to, from the Ukrainians' perspective, that's perfectly legitimate. Is it legitimate to get NATO support for this operation? No, it's not, because NATO's supposedly not a combatant here. So British assets on the ground coordinating this is an act of war, and everybody knows it. But blowing up the train while there's passengers, while there's a passenger train, blowing up the bridge while there's a passenger train there and killing civilians, that's an act of war, folks. And everybody who wants to, still argue that Ukraine is in the right here, better get their heads screwed on straight. So it's not a matter of, well, the Russians killed civilians first. Yeah, okay, fine. It's not about that anymore. They're winning and they're defending their people. Because as far as I'm concerned, and I've always thought this, that everything east of the Dnieper River is Russia. And the rest of it is some Ukraine, some Poland, some Hungary, some Romania, and there's a very small portion of it that's actually quote-unquote Ukrainian. And everything else is nonsense. And from the Russians' perspective, they're defending ethnic Russians from, they may be over the top and openly calling them Nazis, but, whatever, everybody's doing what they have to do in order to justify what they're doing. But when you break it down to brass tacks, that's what it is. And, if you watch the way the Russians are prosecuting this war, it's pretty obvious that they're trying to minimize civilian casualties while they defend civilian populations. It's war. It sucks. People are going to die. But come on. Let's not kid ourselves. The train track is empty 90% of the time. You could have avoided civilian casualties and just blown up the bridge. Okay? Sorry, you could have. Now, the Crimean Bridge is being used 24 hours a day. That's different. That's road traffic. That's different. Somebody's probably going to die. That's different. But their obsession with the Crimean Bridge, the Kerch Strait Bridge, is insane because it was built literally to be repairable at any point if it was, it's been attacked 3 times now, and the Russians have reopened it within days because they designed the bridge to be repairable because it was designed in sections. Like, it's all about writing headlines in the Daily Mail.
Tom, I love the framework you use to look at the world. And zooming a bit back into the US, of course, you have this framework of the colonial powers in Europe, historic powers that are trying to hold onto their power. And of course, the US is trying to free itself through Trump. And perhaps you can explain how tariffs are playing into that and really what the end state required or the end state desired there is.
The end state is this. There's multiple goals to achieve with the tariff policy. One is to balance global trade in some way, manner, shape, or form. It's to change the dynamic of we export debt and buy cheap goods and hollow out the economy, and while paying interest on the debt that we sent out to the people that we but rapidly depreciating consumer goods too. And that's what that dynamic has to end. And you do that by saying, look, we are the world's biggest consumer market, and we're going to charge you a fee to access it. Call it an ATM fee, call it call it a bridge toll. I don't care. Pick whatever metaphor you like. That's what the tariff is. The general tariff is that. The punitive tariff, or what a reciprocal tariff, is trying to also break down the non-tariff structures, the protectionism that exists that every country does, including the United States. We're not blameless here. Everybody does this. Saying, well, your goods aren't good enough, or they're not safe enough, or they're not this enough, or they're not that enough to enter our country without changing the way you do business. You have to change your products in order to our standards in order to get them in, and thereby make them uncompetitive to protect our domestic businesses. The Europeans have been doing this in the car industry forever and a day, and then they export those terrible ideas from Germany and the EU to California. California then turns around and exports it to the rest of the country because they have all the political power. This is a classic. This process should be now very well understood, and so that's part number one. Part number two, of course, is to change the way the U.S. government funds itself. Right. So if you want to cut the way you want to cut the budget, and you want to cut how the American government spends money, because now that we're not deficit spending, well, I'm not saying we've gotten to that point yet, but the goal is to get to the point where we're not deficit spending, right? Where we're not funding the government through taxation to pay for interest on the debt that we issued in order to buy cheap consumer goods that are gone, right? Like, we have nothing to show for any of this. It's literally an entire economy designed around paying interest on buying hookers and blow. That's what they've done. Let's make it simple. We're buying hookers and cocaine, and we're not buying, we're not building, we're not running tool and die shops domestically. So you have to change that dynamic completely. So, and you do that by changing the way the federal government actually funds itself, and you have your choice. You can fund it through debt, or and taxation, which is the current model, and that current model sucks and it only benefits the globalists who, invented the system. Or you put up tariffs and you force a lot lower leverage ratio within the economy. And the government gets smaller by virtue of the fact that you can only buy as much government as you can trade for, right? Which was the original conception of the country in the first place. Moreover, you also, and they have to do that at the same time as you have to open up the balance sheet of the country, which is all these assets that we have not used, we have not utilized. We have plenty of assets, and they're mostly financial and financial plumbing, and our expertise in how to move and the logistics and everything else. That's all got tremendous value. And our leadership in technology and all that has value, and that's part of the American balance sheet. But then there's the other side of the balance sheet, just the raw material wealth of the country that's been written down to zero through ruinous and stupid European-led environmental policy. At a minimum, it's just one aspect of it. Be it refining our own oil as opposed to producing our own gasoline, as opposed to buying North Slope oil and refining it in the Northeast. We make light sweet crude in the United States. It's perfectly good for making gasoline, for refining it into gasoline and diesel fuel, and JP4, jet fuel. Why aren't there refineries in South Dakota, where the freaking Bakken is? Why are there not refineries in Colorado or Texas? I mean, there are refineries in Texas, but you understand what I mean. Why are there no new refineries? We're producing 13 million barrels of oil a day. Why are we still importing oil from around the world to move our cars around in the daily commute. It makes no sense, but it's the way it was designed. And it was, in many ways, it was designed on purpose. And in effect makes us dependent on other sources. So, and maybe for strategic purposes in the 60s and 70s, the North Slope oil was cheap and it was easier. We make all sorts of arguments that go back to that, but it's done 2020s. And, the United States lost millions of barrels of refining capacity during COVID. Refineries were shuttered because of the lack of demand, and they've never come back online. Okay? So, and they're almost, and so you have to get rid of that block in order to move forward, which is why the, Loper Bright the removing of the Chevron doctrine was so important. It's why the Jarkissi case was so important, to get rid of the Star Chamber administrative courts. Like, there's so many things. And those things are wending their way through the courts. Those regulations are being written down, and the investment is coming in. What Trump has sold the world, and he's done a pretty freaking good job of it so far, is to come and invest in the United States, and you'll be able to spend your dollars that you bought from us years ago, and you can buy them and you can move them back into the United States and invest them at par. Those who don't make a deal with us are going to get dollars at 95, are going to pay 90, are going to get dollars for 90, are going to trade dollars for 95 cents. That's what's coming. And the stable coin bill is part of that process. The putting up soft capital controls around gold and silver are part of that process. Vince Lonsky and I have been talking about this in my podcast, and Vince has been talking about it, everywhere now since he and I started working this idea out 2 years ago. And I've got, there's 4 or 5 podcasts I've done with Vince on this particular subject as it's evolved over the last 2 years, that I really do think people should listen to. There's as much to listen to Vince as it is to me, because Vince understands plumbing better than I do. He's phenomenal. And and then I've talked to Caitlin Long about a lot of these things, and literally Vince and I did a podcast the other day. It's the latest episode, I think, where we kind of tie all this stuff together. And I think if you listen to 213 and 220, again, for my guests, not for me, but they were inspired by the stuff that I've talked about, and that's why we have the conversations that we have, and that's why they're like, dude, we need to do a podcast. I'm like, why? Well, because we need to talk about this. I'm like, great, let's do it. Again, it's not, I'm so freaking wise and insouciant. It's because you spark conversation, which is why we do podcasts like this, in order to try and elucidate what's happening in the world. It has nothing to do with, anyone's ego here. It has to do with trying to figure out what's actually happening, right? So, the tariffs are the key to that, because ultimately what Trump wants to do, it's very clear, is that he wants to get rid of the income tax. He wants to do away with the way we fund the government. And we would rather, as a transitional period, or even as a long-term period, it's like, yes, if we're going to have a treasury market, right? Which is how we keep the two-tiered, two-cycle monetary system, right? Central bank, commercial banks, and end users. With the commercial banks in the center, back to doing net interest margin banking and lending, and we need a treasury market for that. Great. Well, we need a treasury market that serves the American people, that gets them to want to buy treasuries, or buy treasuries through proxies, Fannie and Freddie, your insurance companies, their pension funds, or whatever, and do that with a real positive return. That is no small order, and it's a lot of work. And we can have that and change that dynamic, so that anybody who wants to get off the dollar train that currently exists, you're going to be more than welcome to do so. We should be able to catch those treasuries as they're being sold, and then move them into the domestic economy. And maybe it'll require, in the long run, that long-term interest rates are higher than 5%. It's possible. It's even probable. Excuse me, but that happens against the backdrop of a European sovereign debt crisis, or even a global sovereign debt crisis. But the question is the order of operations of who's going to default first, or whose bonds are going to be repudiated first. Again, I'm not selling anybody that there isn't going to be problems in the bond markets globally. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you set up a countervailing process that reverses the old dynamic. It's going to cause chaos, but you're trying to minimize the effect of the chaos, because if you continue doing exactly what you're doing, this whole system is going to collapse. So you can choose between Mad Max, or you can choose to muddle through to a different world. That's what Besant is selling you. That's what he's saying with this 3-3-3 idea. 3% budget deficit, 3%, 3 million barrels of oil, and plus 3 million barrels of oil a day, and 3% interest rates, right? That's what he's trying to sell to people. And I'm okay with that. I think that's a good transition. And it also, in the long run, also depowers the Fed, because it takes the Fed out of being the lender of last resort for the entire world, which is the thing that everybody is now scared of, because the world is net short dollars by a tremendous amount. And they have to, they're going to have to come to us, and we're not going to bail them out at the zero bound like we did under Bernanke and Elon in order to protect our banks. Our banks have decoupled from Europe. Our banks have decoupled from China. And they've been systemically doing that for years. And at least the big ones have, and that's the important part. Our domestic banks, they're not exposed. If they have exposure to Europe at this point, they're stupid. The regional banks should not be investing in, car plants in fucking Germany. Like, that's dumb. Right? And if you are, well, you're going to go under you're going to go under because you were a badly run bank, and there's going to be bank failures. But there will be, new banks that come up in the process. To me, it's like, you're not going to get out of here, as George C. Scott famously said in Dr. Strangelove, we're not going to get out of here without getting our hair mussed. He's talking about nuclear war, of course. But this is financial nuclear war. It's going to be painful. It's going to be difficult. But we can have painful and difficult, or we can have Armageddon. Your choice. I'm hedged with gold. I don't know that, like everybody else, I'm not telling you I know what's the outcome's going to be. So don't be dumb, but bet on both sides. And, stack hard assets while you're doing it. And that's okay, because here's the kicker. The U.S. government wants you to invest in gold. Same way that China wants their people to invest in gold. Like, the U.S. government is literally saying, we're buying gold. We're draining the LBMA. We're going to destroy the gold futures market as the fiction of a physically settled gold futures market that exists in the West, which is nonsense. And for people who want to speculate on gold versus the value of the dollar, there's going to be GLD. Fine. Go use GLD for that. There's very, very liquid options chain over there, but you're never going to get physical gold out of that. Let's just do away with that nonsense, because between the COMEX and the LBMA and all that, we all know how that stuff works. I'm sure you've interviewed 100 people who can describe that circle jerk far better than I can. That just needs to go away. And the physical gold needs to stay here, just like it never leaves China, just like it never leaves Russia, right? Like, what do you think they're doing with the gold that they mine every year? It doesn't leave. Why doesn't it leave? They buy it. If the people don't buy it, the banks buy it, or the sovereign wealth funds buy it, or the government, or the central bank buys it. Certainly in the case of the Russians, right? But what is that doing? It's undergirding the currency with a higher percentage of gold. And if you don't think that, a way out of this for the United States, a way to help offset the balance sheet problem of $36 trillion or $37 trillion worth of debt, isn't a rising gold price. Well, hate to tell you this, but it's true. Oh, it's not enough money. Well, you got to go to like $135,000 an ounce gold to balance that debt. Sure. But bothers me is that when you only focus on debt, right? It's like only focusing on the supply of money, right? So think of it this way. Like Martin Armstrong's been talking about this for years. I bring this up all the time. Under the quantity theory of money, libertarians and Austrians and everybody, they want to focus, and the hard money crowd only ever wants to focus on the supply side of the quantity theory of money. They never want to focus on the demand side, right? They never talk about the demand for money. They never ask themselves, why did the government have to inflate the money supply? Maybe because the demand for money was so high that there wasn't enough dollars out there, so we had to print more dollars in order to liquefy the world. Everybody who thinks the Chinese yuan is going to replace the dollar hasn't done the math to say, well, how much do the Chinese have to inflate the yuan in order to fill the void left by a retreating dollar? My two sides of the same coin. Well, it's the same thing with debt. If you only focus on the debt on someone's balance sheet and you don't focus on the assets and then look at what the net equity is, like when you do a balance sheet, when you look at a company and you sit down and you look at a company, you look at their financial statements, when you read the balance sheet, do you only look at the liabilities? Do you not look at the assets and the leftover equity? If you don't, well, then you're bad at your job. I'm sorry, you're just bad. That's a dumb fucking way of looking at things. That's not the way anybody looks at. That's not the way companies are run. Like, if you've got debt and you've got massive cash flows and you've got massive shareholder equity, then who cares? Debt to equity ratio is an important statistic. Just focusing on the debt and saying that debt to GDP is the equivalent of debt to equity is wrong. Debt to GDP is debt to cash flow.
Yeah, that's only part of the metric for sure.
Am I wrong about that? I mean, if I'm not, so think of it that way. So you have to think of debt to equity. So I brought this up many times when I said, when I looked at BlackRock, and everybody's like, well, BlackRock controls $11 trillion and they're the biggest company. No, they're not the biggest company in the world. The biggest company in the world is Apple, because Apple has very little debt. They've only taken on just to have a credit rating. They have unbelievable shareholder equity, right? And they have unbelievable cash flows. And they have more money in the bank than most countries, right? That's one company, unbelievably overcapitalized. On the other side of the equation, you have BlackRock, which when you look at BlackRock, they control all of these shares that you and I own, but they only have 45 or $48 billion worth of shareholder equity. It's actually not a very big company. Look at the balance sheet of BlackRock. Tell me what you see.
Massive control. Not a large company, agreed. 100%.
So this is what you've got to get past the headlines. You've got to actually do the work. And that's where I lose my mind sometimes when I'm like, guys, it's called a SWOT analysis, SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's a threat. If you only focus on the threat and you forget all the other stuff, you come up with really unbalanced analysis. When I was at Cornerstone up in Calgary 2 weeks ago, when I gave my keynote, I reminded everybody about the 5 most profound words ever spoken in film history by the great philosopher Qui-Gon Jinn in episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Your focus determines your reality. If you focus on the negative, that's all you can see. If you focus on the positive, you only see the positive. If you walk back and forth and try and stay in the moment and absorb everything that's around you, you come to different conclusions. So be careful as what you focus on. Davos would have you focus on nothing but the threats, and therefore to threats to humanity, to their enemies, blah, 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 blah. They're good at it. That's what the media does. So, if it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, even if they're just trying to sell eyeballs. So when you read Zero Hedge, for example, do I read Zero Hedge the same way I read it 10 years ago? No, of course not. You know why? I realize because it's very obvious that headlines are written in order to sell clicks, to sell advertising. It's not to do deep fundamental analysis. That's for the reader to do. I remind everybody that when I started down the road of asking the question about is the Fed trying to save the United States, it was because in an otherwise kind of rote article that Zero Hedge writes every time there's an FOMC meeting, this was a nothing burger, June 2025, 2021. This was a nothing burger of a Fed statement. Nothing had really changed. They only changed this one highly technical little interest rate by 5 basis points. And the only reason I noted it was because the euro fell out of bed the minute the Fed did it. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't even know what the reverse repo rate was. I had to go to Investopedia like everybody else and go, what the fuck is a reverse repo? Right? But then you do the work and you ask the question, why were these two events related? Is there significance here? Does it mean something? And then eventually you come up with a hypothesis, and then you test the hypothesis. I'm not. Again, this is not about me. These are teaching moments, is what I'm getting at, right? I'm not here to tell you how to fish, folks. I'm teaching you how to fish, because if I can teach you how to fish, you're going to help me fish better, so that we can figure out what's going to happen next. That's the point. Because I'm not, it doesn't matter if I'm the smartest guy in the room or not. I'm not smarter than the room. The room is far smarter than I am. Because the room sees more than I could ever see. And again, that's why we do these podcasts. That's why we talk about these things. It's why I sit here and half the time I do half these things, I never even thought about debt to GDP as debt to cash flow until I mentioned it, until I just popped out of my mouth 5 minutes ago. But it's true. Debt to cash flow is not a good metric.
It's not the only metric, that's for sure. Exactly, yeah.
No, it's not the only metric. Yeah. It's a metric that matters if you're in a crisis mode. And yes, so are we in near a crisis mode in the United States? Yes, we are. Are we trying to change the way we do cash flow? So you got to fix the cash flow to be able to fix the balance sheet. So they're trying to fix the cash flow. And we're not there. And again, the fight over the Spurg fight over the big beautiful bill is about whether or not it fixes the cash flow enough. It's great that we're having the conversation, but I also know that that the bill itself may be the best bill we can get at this moment in time. And then the question is, will the United States go broke between now and the time that we can fix the cash flow better? I don't know. I don't think so. Not if Trump is, pulling in $5 to $6 trillion worth of investment into the United States over the next 10 years. No, I don't think so. If he's bringing in an extra, $20 to $30 billion a month in tariff revenue, that fundamentally changes the cash flow that way. If this bill passes and the tariff revenue and the next quarterly statement by the Treasury says, oh, by the way, we're going to need $100 billion less dollars to fund the government than we projected, and all of a sudden the investment world goes, hey, look, the United States is turning the corner, and then they're going to help us fix the rest of the story, because they're going to be like, we want to go there. And then that's going to erode the political base of the people who are standing in the way. And then we're going to get closer to the primary season, where these guys are then going to have to stand on their fiscal hawk bona fides, and it's a process. And to go back to your question about Elon Musk and Donald Trump, Trump is a guy that will take the win, even if the win is only a double or a single and not a grand slam. Elon wants a grand slam. And maybe he's worked hard enough where he feels that he deserves a grand slam. Okay, fair. They'll work it out. Because This is not like Trump won't one day call you the devil and the next day, sit you down for dinner and say, don't. It's like, come on. We're just trying to make this shit work here. Come on. So like that, and that drives people nuts because they don't, they see one thing. Like Bill Maher said a month ago. I had dinner with Donald Trump and like, the guy I see on television is nothing like the guy I had dinner with. Why can't I see that guy more often? I was like, because that guy who you had dinner with can't be president in this environment. Bill, and you know that, but if you weren't a shit lib, you'd be honest with yourself about it.
Tom, so many threads to pull there. I want to take you to gold for a second. You referenced that the world is short dollar. You referenced central bank, the demand for gold from the US. Of course, we know from public central bank gold buying last year, 24% of global gold demand was central banks. The US hasn't been reportedly buying. You believe that move of gold from the LBMA towards the COMEX was for the American central bank. Perhaps you can take us along really how those multiple ideas.
I don't know if it's for the American central bank, but it's for the American balance sheet. Let's just be clear about that. I don't know where it's going to wind up.
Sure. But perhaps you can help us marry those ideas. The world is short dollar. We are stepping away from that previous historic colonial power in Europe, and we're trying to break free of that. With this now new demand for gold, how do all these ideas marry together, and what is the trajectory that we should expect for gold?
Oh, gold is definitely going to go higher. The question is how it goes higher. There's two things to remind yourself about gold. One, in the long run, it's an inflation hedge, right? Over the generational time frame, it's an inflation hedge. It's not a particularly good inflation hedge. Well, it is, and it is somewhat. It's not relative to debt. It is relative to purchasing power. Again, making the argument that the demand for money is an important part of the equation because of. So let's do the old thing, right? In 1935, an ounce of gold would have bought you a good suit. In 2025, an ounce of gold will buy you a pretty good suit. You can go to Men's Warehouse, you can get yourself a pretty good suit and shoes and tie, and not even spend $3,300, to be honest. But if you marry it towards the debt, if you measure it towards the debt, well, then it should be $140,000. But the debt is against every dollar of debt, there's a dollar out there somewhere. In effect, there's an effectual dollar, meaning there's still tremendous demand. And forgive me, but they're mowing my yard next to me, so they're mowing my yard. But the demand for money is such that it's sucked up 95% of that inflation. So, in terms of purchasing power, long-term inflation hedge. In the short term, gold responds to geopolitical concerns. And and again, I'm kind of cribbing off of Marty Armstrong because he taught it to me, and I now agree with him about this. The way gold operates is it rises rapidly during times of geopolitical stress and then doesn't give back most of its gains. So you get these spasms higher on geopolitical turmoil, and then it gives back 30% of that move. But in the long run, it's dealing with it's offsetting your loss of purchasing power. In the short term, there are opportunities where gold overshoots and then corrects. And I think that's the best way to look at gold from a long-term, if you're a gold bull in the long term, this is the way you should look at it. This is a hard-won lesson for me. I've always been a guy that I always, at the end of the day, I don't invest much in the stock market. I don't do a lot of that stuff. I do it for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is I don't like to have my personal positions really cloud my judgment. So for the most part, I just buy hard assets, stick them in the ground, and live off of my cash flow. I do a little bit of savings, but not a tremendous amount. And it's for that reason of, the way I have to operate psychologically. It's for my own personal failings as a human being. But for long-term gold investors and gold bulls, you're right. You should be long gold, and everybody should have a certain amount of their portfolio in gold. And at times of geopolitical stress, you should have more, and then you should lighten up when you get out of a chaos period. And because when there's no geopolitical turmoil, the demand for the currency is going to rise as people then start realizing, oh, I can go out and I get 6%. I can get out and get a 6% real return in that with my money, as opposed to the 1 or 2% that I'm losing, or 3% that I'm losing in gold in purchasing power every year. Okay, so if medium-term interest rates are real and positive, gold doesn't have a short-term thesis statement, but it does in the long run, because governments, the way they've been running, and certainly when they run on debt against your labor, that model, it's gonna work out for you. So then the question is, and then after that, it just comes down to how you navigate. So if we lived in a different world, if the world that Trump is trying to create through tariffs and different revenue model for the United States, what it'll mean is that the gold bull market will be over in any structural sense, other than you should save a certain amount of your wealth in gold in order to have it for short-term liquidity problems in case you personally get into trouble. But there will be no real arbitrage in the long run at that point, because there won't be the kind of leverage in the system where you will have structural real inflation, or at least as much structural real inflation. You will have some, but it can be mitigated. And if we move to digital currencies, and I don't mean of the type and kind that the European Union wants, but if we go to a crypto standard, or we go to a crypto dollar, or stablecoin abstraction, where the dollar can be infinitely divided, just like Bitcoin can be, in effect, infinitely divided, we don't need to inflate to deal with the demand for money, because the money itself has enough divisions to allow for more nuanced comparisons between goods and services, right? And this is that's the part where money breaks down. That's why the demand for money rises, right? You have one of two options when the demand for money rises. You can either add decimal places to the currency unit, or you can inflate and add zeros to the currency unit. You don't have any other options, because at the end of the day, why did the gold coin standard fail? It failed because of the need for credit, and the fact that eventually the free market was so good, which is deflationary. The free market is deflationary. Technology is deflationary, right? Like I have an infinitely better iPhone today than I had 7 years ago. It's deflationary. This thing is more powerful than the old one was. Roughly the same price.
Yeah, and for TVs, even lower prices nowadays.
Yeah, and even lower prices. Now they're even making them even cheaper, right? And now you can get right, exactly. And so now think about the entry-level iPhone today and what you can get it for, and think about the entry-level iPhone you could get 10 years ago, right? Now, you have one of two options. So at some point, the comparison between this and some other object, say a laptop, we can still measure that in dollars. But what happens the day when we can't measure that in terms of 5 cents or 1 cent? We have to go to 1/10 of a cent. Let's talk about screws, for example. Let's talk about washers, right? Is it cost effective to buy one washer? No, of course not. But, you buy 100 washers for $1, or you buy 1,000 washers for $1, you're paying 1/10 of a cent a piece for them. The monetary unit can't deal with that. Now, am I arguing that the current system works? No. Clearly, the system is creating more money than it's creating value because of the way it's operating. I agree with all of that. So we have to bring the leverage in the system down. We have to bring the We have more money than we need. No argument. But the other side of the problem is if we have banks, people, mortgages, this, that, and everything else tied to the current level of valuations with the current stock of money, and you want to contract that by 90%, what do you think is going to happen to the society? What do you think is going to happen to the legal structure and the political structure and everything else? Or do you do what the Fed's been doing, which is trying to shrink or at least slow the growth of M2? And they did. They moved the growth of M2 negative in order to start crushing the leverage out of credit-based assets, asset prices. And so I've always thought that the real reorganization that has to happen, and what stagflation really is a deflation of credit sensitive assets and an inflation of commodity assets prices, so that you get a rebalancing of the whole. And then in the process, wages get reindexed to the new price level. But if you don't change the system that created that imbalance in the first place, you're going to continue to do this over and over and over again, buying more hookers and blow and not building anything. And when you reach the point where all you're making is hookers and blow, spending your money on, which is what we're doing. Now we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on hookers and blow to invade the United States and destroy its culture. Okay? Through NGOs and everything else, right? So what I would say is change the system without breaking the current system. And anybody arguing that we should just rip the Band-Aid off and and I had this argument with Dave Collum yesterday on Tommy Kerrigan's podcast. I'm like, Dave, I'm not willing to live in that world. You're at the end of your life. I'm not there yet. Sorry, I'm not doing it. I'm just not doing it. And I argued with him for half an hour about it. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing it. And I don't get the sense from a lot of people that they want to do it either. And, they're willing to work a little harder to make the situation change and to change the thing. And as I was watching a thing from a short video from Mike Benz this morning right before we went online, we started recording, and he was saying, look, you've got all these kids over at Doge that, this is why Elon's angry. He got all these people working 24/7 to identify all these cuts, and they did it for free, and they did it because they love their country, and they did it because they want to save their society, and all of these things. And the best the government can come up with is $9 billion out of the $200 billion that they found. If I was Elon Musk, I'd be a little pissed off too. But, go back and tell me how they stole 40 House seats and 5 Senate seats, and tell me that they would have gotten, how much more of those cuts that he found would have been codified into this bill. If Trump had a comfortable, real majority in the House and Senate that could overcome who we know are the obvious freaking traitors. This is why I'm angry with Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. They can't be those guys. They can't be fair weather friends at this moment. They have to be rock solid, because or they're only interested in being right as opposed to fixing anything. And I am not interested in people who need to be right. When you want to be right, don't be in the resign from the Congress, resign from the Senate, go back to the book club, go hang out in Auburn, Alabama, do your thing. But don't be an obstructor. That's what Trump is complaining about. And he's absolutely right to be complaining about it. Because if I were in Trump's position, it's exactly what I would be saying to them. Like, this is the best we can do right now. It's not I can't do anything better. Maybe I can get 5% more, 10% more, fine. We'll come up with a slightly better version of the bill. But this is it. And you know it. So shut the fuck up. By the way, Rand Paul, I think this morning I saw him attack Lindsey Graham directly about the bill, saying this was a bill birthed by Lindsey Graham in order to get, and I'm like, finally, Rand, finally, you're actually engaging in the real politics of the day. The real politic of the day. Now turn on the guy who is the ringleader for the opposition in the GOP because they want war. And then there was Tucker Carlson pointed out on X this morning about Mark Levin going to the White House trying to, bitch at Trump to, go to war with Iran. And like, no. And all of this is happening, by the way, while Netanyahu's coalition is falling in Israel, which was completely predictable, by the way. So, I don't know. That's, again, you see all this stuff happening and you're like, what does it all mean? It means that it's a fight and everybody is putting their card on the table and they're all playing their big cards and they're all pushing their chips, or they're pushing their chips in the middle of the pot, and someone is holding the nuts and someone isn't. And we're going to find out who's holding the nuts.
In the last podcast we did, you referenced you had a history of being a metallurgist, a scientist to a certain extent. I would love to hear your opinion on tungsten. We saw the price spike this year, if we are to believe Almonty, which is a tungsten producer, with 50%. Perhaps you can share some insights you have on supply-demand dynamics and perhaps also whether this is an interesting investment opportunity.
I don't know. I haven't looked at the tungsten market at all. I can just tell you that it's an incredibly strategic metal. It's an incredibly important metal. Vietnam is an incredibly important source of the metal. So anybody's relationship with Vietnam is incredibly important because there aren't, from what I remember, and my information on tungsten is probably 10 years out of date, other than the Russians and probably Kazakhstan and that whole area of Central Asia and Vietnam, there isn't a whole lot of tungsten goods supply out there. So, and it's an incredibly important metal for advanced metallurgy and where we're headed in so many different ways. I mean, it is an incredibly important metal for, nickel superalloys and the rest of it. So, I don't know, if we're seeing a squeeze in the tungsten price, it's telling me that there's a movement happening. I wonder if there's, I'm just vamping here. I don't know. Is this a structural shift because of the needs of either airframes and or rockets is the way I would look at it, because that's where a lot of the tungsten demand, outside of tungsten carbide and all that stuff, it's saw blades and all that. I'm not talking about that. If there's a structural demand shift that's happened in the tungsten market that isn't related to sanctions on Russia and the lack of supply coming from the Russians, right? I don't know if that's also, if the Russians are just saying, look, we're not going to sell our tungsten to the world anymore, well, you're going to see a 50% jump in the price. But, those metals, and what I mean by those metals, I mean what we commonly call the space metals, the third row transition metals, from tantalum out to tungsten. Those are all really important. And there's not a lot of supply of them. And so there's not been a whole lot of research done on them. But every time we use them for anything, we get a major step function in the quality of our metallurgy, right? So from tantalum to osmium to rhenium to tungsten, all of those metals are so freaking important because their melting points are so freaking high, their density is so, there's so many things about them, and that they're just a really important group of metals. And it's the major reason why anybody wants to go into space, because that's where they are in larger quantities than we can get here. And, there's plenty of nickel in the world. There's plenty of iron, right? That's not it's the tantalum, the tungsten, the rhenium, the osmium. Rhenium is still the world's most expensive metal, right? By far. It's like $8,700 an ounce, the last I checked. So it's insane how important rhenium is. And if you know anything about aerospace, that's where it's primarily used, right? The whole Hastelloy series they're all 2 to 3 weight percent rhenium. Imagine how expensive a pound of Hastelloy. I haven't checked how much a pound of Hastelloy X is, right? But it's literally the only friggin' nickel superalloy that can withstand the temperatures of jet engines. I worked in that. I worked on that at some point in my past, and it was never. I could never like crack the code to do it. In surface modification, I could never crack the code because it's just not there. That's going to be non-aqueous electrochemistry. It's going to be far above my pay grade as a chemist and as a metallurgist. So I'm not, I'm not going to. I'm not going to comment on that, but I'm just going to tell you that, like, we're going to space, folks. Like, that's happening, and that's happening quickly, and that's going to be fun. It's going to be fun to watch the whole space is fake and gay crowd, like, have to, eat their words. It's what's happening. It's what's coming.
Tom Luongo, thank you so much for your time and your generosity with that and your knowledge as well. I'll put the links in the description, but how can people get in touch with you and keep following you?
And do the thing, as it were, right? TFL 1728. TFL 1728 on Twitter, Patreon/GoldGoatsAndGuns, the blog over goldgoatsandguns.com, where the newsletters and the podcasts are all curated and all of that. That's our gig. It's how we make our vig every month, right? So I can keep doing this. And as always, shout out to my unbelievable community. They keep me well informed as to what is going on, well beyond my capacity to do it. If they didn't do it, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because I wouldn't be nearly as interesting as people seem to think I am. So there you go.